Hey everyone, let's dive right into this explainer dissecting Victor Davis Hanson's recent commentary. He's talking about a massive ideological shift that he sees sweeping right through the Democratic Party. Whether you're a political theory junkie or you're just kind of curious about the shifting tides in American politics, Hanson argues we are witnessing a profound transformation. So today we're going to impartially unpack his thesis, look at the evidence he brings to the table, and check out his predictions for this totally new political landscape.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll be running through 1. The socialist resurgence argument, 2. Profiles of the movement, 3. The affluence paradox, 4. The strategy of masking, and finally, 5. America's historical stance.
All right, starting us off with Section 1, the socialist resurgence argument, where we need to understand his core thesis.
So Hanson's central thesis here argues that a new iteration of democratic socialism is actively taking over the Democratic Party right now. He sets this firmly in 2026, and he describes it not as your traditional old-school socialism, but as a, quote, strange kind of socialism. According to him, it's being driven by a wave of young zealots who are actively moving away from traditional American norms.
Well, what does this ideology actually look like in practice? Hanson notes this movement completely rejects free market capitalism and is incredibly critical of the unique American historical narrative. They're even questioning the upcoming 250th anniversary celebrations for the Declaration of Independence. Their goals really skew toward equality of result rather than equality of opportunity. And to get there, they're seeking to impose enormous wealth taxes and dramatically expand entitlements to just entirely upend the American status quo.
Moving right along to Section 2, Profiles of the Movement. Let's look at the faces of Hanson's argument.
Hanson doesn't just speak in abstract concepts, he actually names names across the country. Up in Maine, he highlights Mr. Platner, a veteran, leaning on vague anti-wealth messaging. Over in Michigan, you've got Mr. Al-Sayed, an epidemiologist who Hanson claims adds an Islamicist tinge to the movement. Nationally, of course, there's Bernie Sanders, who he characterizes as this perennial mid-80s candidate who is finally finding his audience. And down in New York, he points to Mr. Mamdani, a former rap singer turned immigrant mayor pushing a heavy socialist agenda.
To really deepen this critique, Hanson zeroes in on Mamdani's background specifically. He notes that Mamdani actually comes from an Indian-American community in Uganda, a demographic that makes up literally just 1% of the population over there. Flipping the movement's own terminology back on itself, Hanson categorizes this background as being settler colonialists in a foreign country, highlighting what he sees as a massive ideological irony.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, the affluence paradox. Let's examine the messengers themselves.
This is absolutely crucial to Hanson's analysis. He points out a stark, almost glaring contrast between the movement's message and the actual messengers. On one side, you have this platform of radical wealth redistribution and slapping heavy taxes on millionaires. But on the flip side, Hanson argues these politicians overwhelmingly originate from the upper middle class. It's a working-class message being delivered by people with highly affluent, privileged backgrounds.
To really drive this paradox home, Hanson brings up a highly publicized moment involving Representative Ilhan Omar. He notes a reported instance where she claimed a staggering net worth of $30 million. Now, while she did walk this back after facing criticism, Hanson still uses this $30 million figure to spotlight the massive wealth that's accumulating among the very people championing wealth redistribution.
And he builds this case even further with more examples. You've got Platner relying on a government pension, his dad bought his house, and his sole oyster client is his mother's upscale restaurant. Mamdani's youth was heavily subsidized by wealthy, endowed professor and filmmaker parents. Bernie Sanders owns 3 homes, and Talarico is heavily subsidized by his parents. Hanson's ultimate takeaway here, modern socialism is not some grassroots working-class uprising. He actually calls it a, quote, boutique fetish of the upper class, comparing it to Marx and Engels.
Okay, let's jump into Section 4, the strategy of masking, or hiding the label.
So you might be wondering, how do these politicians find any electoral success if the American public generally rejects socialism? Well, Hanson posits that there's a very intentional strategy of masking going on. Because the electorate historically favors rugged individualism, he argues these candidates obscure their true agendas. They're basically deciding to hide their radical political views until they are safely elected.
Hanson points the finger at some pretty prominent figures as practitioners of this masking strategy. We're talking national leaders like Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, Joe Biden, all the way to regional politicians like Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey, and Katie Wilson in Seattle. By keeping their most progressive plans totally under wraps and using working-class proxies, he argues they can appeal to voters far outside deep blue districts. This strategy fundamentally changes how voters need to evaluate campaign promises, which really highlights why paying close attention to political rhetoric matters so much in our own communities right now.
And finally, Section 5, America's historical stance. Let's check out his prognosis for November.
To put all of this into historical context, Hanson draws a parallel to the perennial socialist candidate Eugene Debs. Debs actually began his presidential runs way back in 1900. By 1920, get this, Debs ran his campaign from prison and still secured over 1 million votes. Tracing that historical line directly to 2026, Hanson emphasizes that what we are seeing today is not standard politics. He views this current wave as a rare, once-in-a-century ideological shock to the American system. So, how does this all end? Hanson concludes with a very firm prediction. He argues that right now this is restricted to a, quote, blue state phenomenon, thriving mostly in hyper-local, left-leaning elections. But because he firmly believes the core American tradition fundamentally rejects communism, statism, and socialism, his prognosis is pretty clear. Once these candidates face the bright lights of a national stage and can no longer hide their agendas, the movement will ultimately fail.
As we barrel toward the November elections, the ultimate question this explainer leaves us with is this. Will Hanson's assessment of the American electorate actually prove correct? Will this new wave of politicians reshape the entire nation, or will that national spotlight cause the public to decisively reject them? It is a fascinating dynamic shift for sure. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning what you see out there on the political stage.